is entitled A Sting in the Tail. We have with us Dave Goulson on bumblebees, and he'll be introduced by Shri Valmik Thapar, so I'm not going to delay any further. So, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have very little time, so I'm not going to do the introduction I planned. Very quickly, I've spent a life working with tigers. Dave has spent a life working with bumblebees. What's more important? The bumblebee. Okay? Why? Because you can't have tigers if you don't have the bee. And I don't know whether we could have human life if we don't have the bee. Dave is going to present something with a PowerPoint. I'm not going to say any more. I'm actually going to join you in the audience to look at that presentation, and I hope you enjoy it. Dave, to you.
No. Are we there? Can you hear me? Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It might seem slightly quirky to be talking about bees at a literature festival, but I spent the last 20 years studying bees, and I want to impart a little bit of information about them and their importance to you today. So the first thing I'd like to stress is that there are loads of different species of bee. I think many people think there's one, and that beekeepers keep them in a hive and they collect honey from them. Actually, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So on the left there you have the honeybee. In India there are 6 species, but they all look rather similar. They're the things, the managed domesticated bees that people have looked after for at least 4,000 years. The ancient Egyptians had honeybee hives that they managed. But there are 22,000 other species of bee in the world, and I think hardly anybody knows that. So the ones I study are the ones in the middle. They're bumblebees, and I'll tell you more about those in a minute. But then further to the right there, you can see a few pictures of representative examples of the thousands of other species of bee in the world. And they're all important. They all pollinate something. They all pollinate wildflowers or crops. And we wouldn't have flowers if we didn't have bees. Bees evolved about 120 million years ago. Once upon a time, there was a wasp that turned vegetarian, and that's essentially became the first bee. And it's the relationship between bees and plants via pollination which has led to the evolution of flowers. If it weren't for bees, we would have a world that was completely lacking in flowers, which would be rather depressing, I think. So they've been around an awful long time, and as we'll see, they're in trouble, and we need to do something to help them. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about my favorite bees, which are bumblebees, which sadly don't live here, but they do live in India, and I'll show you where in just a moment. Bumblebees all belong to one genus. It has the Latin name Bombus, which I've always thought is a rather nice Latin name. They have an annual life cycle which starts in the spring when a big fat queen bee comes out of hibernation and she looks for somewhere to nest. So in early spring in Europe, I don't know quite what the phenology would be in India, so in a month or so's time we'll see these big queens emerging from hibernation. They fly around low to the ground looking for a hole in the ground where they can nest, and if they find one, then they build a little ball of pollen, they lay eggs, and they incubate them. Just like a bird, the mother sits on her eggs and she shivers to keep warm, to keep her brood warm, and so that they grow quickly. And in a few weeks' time, she has her first batch of offspring, which are daughters. They're all daughters of the queen, but they're workers. They never reproduce themselves, and they devote their lives to helping their mother rear more and more sisters. And so a bee colony is a huge sisterhood of bees looking after their mother, essentially, which sounds terribly harmonious and lovely. At the height of the summer, a bumblebee colony will turn itself over to producing males and new queens, which fly off and mate. The males don't do any work in the nests. In most social insects like bees or ants or whatever, Males have one job in life, which is to mate. They don't do anything else. And it's actually rather sad that, so in bumblebees, for some reason that no one's ever managed to explain, there are about 7 times as many males as there are new queens. And the queens only mate once in their life. Just after they emerge, they mate with one male and then they immediately go into hibernation, which means that 6 out of 7 male bees never get to do the one thing in life that they were born to do. The queens, as soon as they've mated, they go into hibernation and wait till the following spring, and then the old nest dies off completely. The old queen dies and those males die, and that's the end of the bumblebee year. Now, bumblebees are pretty unusual insects in that they're cold climate specialists. I remember being taught when I was at school that that insects are cold-blooded. So mammals and birds are warm-blooded. They have a stable, warm body temperature. But things like lizards and amphibians and insects, their body temperature is the same as the ambient air temperature around them. That's not always true, and bees are a really good example where it isn't true. They actually regulate their body temperature. They keep warm by generating heat, by flapping their wings, and that enables them to fly around in really cold weather when other insects can't be active. So this funny map here, which you probably can't see terribly well, but it shows the places in the world where you can find bumblebees. We think actually that bumblebees evolved about 30 million years ago, so much later than the beginning of bees, somewhere in the Himalayan mountains, and that's still to this day the hot spot for bumblebee diversity in the world. Where you can see in orange on this map, there are about 60 species of bumblebees, not so far from here to the north. But they don't like warm weather, so they've spread around the globe, around the cool parts of the northern hemisphere, west into Europe and east into Siberia, and then down through the Americas. But they peter out in warmer climates. So where we are right now is, I think, just too far south for you to see any bumblebees. But if you go just a little way north, you'll see lots of them. I do need to abbreviate this talk slightly because I was expecting to be allowed to ramble on a bit longer, so bear with me if I skip 1 or 2 slides. There we go. So this shows you an infrared picture of a bumblebee. You can just about see some forceps coming in from the left which are holding it in position, so you can imagine it's a really angry bee and it's buzzing away, but you can see that it's kind of glowing white hot in the middle. Obviously it's not literally white hot, but it's at about 35 degrees centigrade, which is the same temperature more or less as our own body. And as I say, they produce heat by flapping their wings. To stay in the air, a bumblebee needs to flap its wings about 200 times a second. And if you try and flap your arms 200 times a second, you'll realize why that generates a lot of heat. And this enables them to fly around in the high mountains, to live right up into the Arctic Circle, and so on. But it comes at a cost, which is that it uses huge amounts of energy for such a small creature to keep itself warm. So someone once calculated that a running man burns the calories in a Mars bar. I don't know whether you have Mars bars in India, but it's a standard kind of chocolate bar. It takes an hour of running to burn off the calories that you took in that one moment of weakness, which is kind of depressing. If you were lucky enough to be a man-sized bumblebee, which would be quite exciting, then you could burn those calories in just 30 seconds of flying, which is one of those kind of extraordinary things. But it explains why, as we'll see in a minute, that our bees aren't doing so well, because they need an awful lot of nectar, of sugar-rich nectar from flowers to keep them in the air. And if they run out of that, then they're in trouble. Now, I've just realized that I meant to read you a very short bit from my book. I've left my book over there, so just bear with me. So this is actually my very first memory of bumblebees. And I should stress that I was very young when this happens, which explains why I was quite so foolish. So, on one occasion, after a heavy summer rainstorm, I found a number of bedraggled bumblebees clinging to my buddleia, and I decided to dry them out. So these were bees that had basically got caught out in the cold. They'd run out of food and were unable to take off, and they were in trouble. Unfortunately for the bees, I was perhaps a bit too young to have a good grasp of the practicalities. With hindsight, finding my mum's hairdryer and giving them a gentle blow dry might have been the most sensible option. Instead, I laid the torpid bees on the hot plate of the electric cooker, covered them in a layer of tissue paper and turned the hot plate onto low. Being young, I got bored of waiting for them to warm up and wandered off to feed my gerbils. Sadly, my attention didn't return to the bees until I noticed the smoke. The tissue paper had caught fire and the poor bees had been frazzled. I felt terrible. My first foray into bumblebee conservation was a catastrophic disaster. I have got a little bit better since, I hope. Okay, so jumping on rather a long time, when I was just started as a university academic about 30 years later, 25 years later, that was when I first started studying bumblebees scientifically. And I just want to tell you a little bit about that. So I mentioned they need an awful lot of nectar to keep them flying. And they've evolved a whole range of really impressive mechanisms, tricks, to make them very efficient at gathering nectar. You've probably heard of the honeybee's waggle dance, which enables them to communicate within the nest and tell each other about patches of flowers. They're able to navigate over enormous distances. So a bumblebee or a honeybee will happily fly 3 or 4 kilometers to a patch of food and back again. And it probably gets a bit silly making comparisons with man-sized bees again. I've already done that once. But just to give you an illustration of how impressive that is for the size of a bee, in terms of its size, going 3 kilometers to find food and bring it back is the same as a human going 10 times around the globe to find some food and then having to go all the way back again. Considering how little they are, it's really quite amazing that they can navigate over such big distances. They also do other things to maximize the amount of food they can collect per time. And this was what first hooked me into studying them. And it's something that everyone can see. Most species of bee do this. If you find a sunny day, perhaps not today, and a patch of flowers, and watch the bees in that patch of flowers, you'll see something, which is that the bees don't visit every flower. They fly around going very close to flowers, but just as this bee is doing here, they put their antennae out close to the flower, but very often they don't actually land. At the very last second, they veer away, and they might approach 3 or 4 flowers before they actually land and put their tongue into the flower and drink the nectar. And I saw this in a little nature reserve one day, and I thought, what are they doing? What's wrong with the flowers that they don't land on? And so I started looking into it. I got little glass microcapillary tubes to measure the amount of nectar in the flowers, and the ones they were avoiding didn't have as much nectar in. And I thought, okay, so they can somehow tell which flowers are full and which ones are empty, but how can they tell? And I played around manipulating the amount of nectar in flowers. You can add nectar to flowers artificially and so on. And it quickly became apparent that they weren't directly detecting the amount of nectar in a flower. Actually, they were doing something else. And it actually took me and a PhD student of mine called Jane Stout 5 years to get to the bottom of this, so I'll cut it very short. But actually what the bees are doing is they're sniffing the flower with their antennae to see if it smells of the faint whiff of a previous bee visit. Every time a bee lands on a flower, she leaves behind a little oily smear of hydrocarbons, just as we do when we leave a fingerprint on a wine glass. And if a flower smells of a recent visit by another bee, then it will be empty because that previous bee will have taken the food. So what bees are doing is sniffing every flower and distinguishing the ones that have been recently emptied and not bothering to waste time landing on them, which strikes me as quite a clever trick when you think that their brain is a fraction of the size of a grain of rice, and yet they're able to do this very rapid assessment of flowers in a tiny fraction of a second based on just a few molecules of the smell of a previous bee. And pollinating their fruit trees, because there are no bees left in this area of southwest China, They've wiped them out through very intensive farming, lots of pesticides and so on. So they now have to hand pollinate every flower to get the fruit, which is really extraordinary and depressing. I mean, people are very poor at pretending to be bees. Bees are much more efficient at pollinating flowers than we are. And so we really need to avoid this happening elsewhere in the world. The nice thing is that there are lots of ways that we can all help. Sorry, trying to change slides again. Come on, you can do it. Oh, now it's skipped too, don't worry. So about 8 years ago, I became a little bit frustrated by, I was a scientist studying bee declines, but my studies were just read by other scientists who did some more research on bee declines, and nothing was actually being done to help the bees. So I set up a charity devoted to conserving bumblebees. It's called the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. I've no idea whether such a thing might, or something similar might work elsewhere in the world, such as here. But Britain's a bit unusual in that we have quite a large community of enthusiastic amateur naturalists who are happy to pay a membership to a society as specialized as the Bumblebee Conservation Trust. And it's done really well. We have 13,000 members, and we do lots of things to help save our bees. Now, conservation is often a bit of a doom and gloom and depressing story. People get turned off by hearing that the ice caps are melting, that the polar bears will soon have nowhere to live. In Britain, we often hear about tigers and the troubles that they face. And often as an individual, you feel there isn't really much you can do to help, particularly with these large mammals. With bees, there is, because they live all around us. They live in our gardens, they live in our cities, and hence, things you do can directly help to support them. And there are lots of things that you can do. The reason I'm standing here, the reason I wrote the book, is to try and raise awareness of the importance of bees. Because I think very few people realize how many of them there are, or what they can do to help them, or just how serious the crisis in bee declines really is. And obviously, the more people I tell, hopefully, I'm sure you won't all rush away and do something to help bees, but maybe one or two of you will. And if that happens, then my day will have been well spent. So there are lots of ways you can raise awareness about these issues. Tell your neighbors, tell your friends, or whatever. I think it's really important to talk to children and explain to them the importance of wildlife, of bees, but of looking after the environment more generally. And bees are a really nice way into that because they're a part of the natural environment, which is obviously really important to us. It directly affects our well-being, the fate of bees. But I think that's just a useful foot in the door to then explain to people that actually the rest of our wildlife is also intimately linked to our own fates, and we should look after it. So this picture here just shows you some primary school children in Scotland. At the top, they were first asked to draw a bumblebee, and they produced some pretty hopeless, inaccurate pictures because they're only little and they didn't know anything about bumblebees. Big round blobby things with yellow and black stripes. Could have been tigers, some of them. You probably can't see them terribly well from back there. And then at the end of the lesson, 2 hours later, they were asked to draw them again, and they do much better drawings, which unless you're right at the front, you won't be able to appreciate. And I doubt, actually, sadly, many of you can also appreciate. But look how much happier they are after 2 hours of hearing about bumblebees. There's a little blonde kid at the top who looks bored as anything by the whole process. 2 hours later, he's beaming away. Hearing about bees makes people happy. Sometimes, anyway. The simple thing you can do to help bees is plant flowers, the right kinds of bee-friendly flowers, in your garden, in a window box on your house, anywhere. And even in the middle of a big city, bees will find it and they'll have a bit of extra food. You will have helped them in a little way. And I don't have any experience of gardening in India and what are the right plants for bees here. I do know that in Britain it's very, very easy to grow the right plants to encourage bees, particularly kind of traditional cottage garden plants and herbs. Most herbs that you might grow to use in your cooking, things like sage and rosemary and marjoram and chives and so on, are also really good for bees. So they're dual purpose. Squeeze some of those into your back garden. You can use them yourself, and the bees will thank you for it by turning up and foraging. What I always discourage people from using, come on, change slides. Oh, there we go. Now, I don't know exactly how relevant this is here, but in Europe we have these annual bedding plants, these annual plants that garden centres sell that people buy and they plant in their gardens. They're absolutely rubbish. I strongly recommend you not to buy anything that looks like that. Aside from the fact that they're really tasteless and garish and over, they've been selected for all these bright colours and huge petals, and they've lost their original function. Flowers evolved to be pollinated by bees, and these flowers, they've lost their nectar and their pollen, or they've been selected to be such a strange shape that bees can no longer get into them in some instances. You might as well have plastic flowers as these things. So don't buy any, if you have things along those lines here in India, don't buy them, please. I don't really know why the gnome is there, that's just a personal thing. Okay, try and squeeze in some of these traditional cottage garden plants and some wildflowers if you have room. And if you don't have your own garden, then consider, come on. Oh, sorry, I best skip that one. This is very slow. It won't listen to me. That's my youngest son, by the way, but I won't explain why he's posed there. That's a little homemade nest box for bees. Oh, there we go. If you don't have your own space, garden, whatever, then there's lots of publicly owned land around which could be made bee-friendly. And often if you think of parks where often there's lots of mown grass, or school grounds, or whatever it might be, places that are often managed by mowing them over and over again, get rid of those mown areas, or at least some of them, and allow them to grow, plant some wildflowers. This shows you a scheme in Scotland, in the city of Stirling, where there are now a little local interest group have planted 50 patches of wildflowers on the sides of roads, that's where this one is, on roundabouts, next to rugby pitches, in school playing fields and so on. And you see extraordinary numbers of happy bees and other insects, butterflies and hoverflies and so on, feeding on these flowers in areas which otherwise would have had no flowers and virtually no wildlife at all. Looking after our bees in cities is really important. Actually, it's underappreciated that an awful lot of human food is grown in and around cities these days. A lot of the big agricultural crops grown out in the countryside are cash crops grown for export. And a large proportion of the food that people in the world actually eat is often grown themselves or by local farmers in small-scale farming, growing food for local markets. And that's certainly relevant here. So we need bees in our cities as well as in the countryside to pollinate all the lovely fruit and veg that we might want to grow ourselves in and around our cities. Okay, there are many other things I could tell you about, but because of the abbreviated session, I haven't really got time. Let me just round up by saying, well, firstly, obviously, it'd be great if you bought my book, but bees have been quietly pollinating our crops since we started growing top crops 10,000 years ago. Up until now, they've done so with no reward from us, but now they are in trouble and they do need our help. So if everyone here could just try and do one little thing, one way or another, to some of the things that I've mentioned to help bees, then that could make a real difference. And bees do exemplify the broader environment. We need to look after all of our wildlife, our biodiversity, because our lives and our futures are inextricably linked to the fates of all of these organisms that do all sorts of vital things in terms of not just pollination, but keeping our soils healthy and so on. So try and do your bit, please. And thank you very much for listening to me.